We feel very proud and privileged to be organizing this now with you. This event as such, I think it's the third or fourth time we're doing something together. So thank you, Vincent, for giving us that opportunity. Thank you also to NRC, particularly the Geneva team, but also the Iraq team, for working with us, particularly on this event, and also particularly on the report covering principled humanitarian action in Iraq. My name is Ed Schenkenberg. I'm the director of HERE-Geneva, a small think tank that actually undertakes studies, both commissioned pieces of work and also a number of our own. We have a number of research projects ourselves. And also part of our name, in fact, HERE, one of the E's stands for exchange, which in fact implies that we're also keen to have a dialogue on the issues that we're finding in our research. And particularly, that's also why we're here today. A warm welcome also particularly to the speakers and the moderator for this afternoon. Hervé, Raquel, Irene, Julia, Jamie, and Nicola. I should say indeed Jamie, because on the sign and in your program it says Mats. He doesn't look like Mats, and I don't think you walk like Mats, so probably it isn't Mats. Actually, very sorry for that. Mats almost couldn't make it today, so in fact Jamie is the director of NRC, the NRC office in Geneva. They're going to obviously engage in the discussion and hopefully also later on engage in the discussion with you. What I would like to do for the next 10-15 minutes max, probably more 10, is a little bit set the stage for this afternoon. And to talk a little bit about the issues that we have discovered and that we sort of unravel in this report, Principled Humanitarian Action in Iraq, particularly looking at partners funded by ECHO, but perhaps also more broadly looking at humanitarian actors. But this is not the only study, in fact, that is sort of the background for the discussion here this afternoon. There's the MSF. In fact, the other two are more research projects, I should say. There's the MSF Emergencies Gap series. MSF Barcelona has been particularly leading on that, and I'm sure Raquel will talk more about that. And then, in fact, the last set of reports and studies is this set, Secure Access in Volatile Environments, already came out at the end of last year, done by Humanitarian Outcomes together with GPPI. So Julia, as the moderator for today, was also involved in that. These three pieces of work together, we hope, or I hope, will inform the discussion for this afternoon. So what I will do in the next 10 minutes is quickly share with you some of the analysis that comes up in these studies. Then talk a little bit deeper about some of the issues that we have seen, particularly in Iraq, but that also come up in the other studies. And then lastly, I would probably end with a question, which is the moment also, Julia, that you would take it further into the discussion here with the speakers. On the analysis side, and actually it sounds very strange to be saying this, particularly here in a building belonging to the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. More than half a century ago, humanitarian action was designed to be delivered in volatile environments, including armed conflict. In 2017, however, principled humanitarian action in Iraq, but also in a number of other places, seems to concentrate on areas that are less insecure and less volatile. So when organizations do work in situations in countries in armed conflict, they particularly are concentrated in the areas that are less insecure, more secure you could say, and less volatile. And that is actually, that brings me to the next point, in the sense that actually, and again this sounds very strange saying it in this environment, the majority, or at least a large number of organizations, seems to have an issue particularly, or a problem with, particularly with the principle of impartiality, there where it concerns the element of most in need. Which is to say that when actually there's a relationship between need, levels of insecurity, and presence of organizations, then immediately we have to recognize that there is an issue with most organizations being concentrated in the areas that are more secure. Presumably in those areas there are needs, but the question is, where are people most in need? And this issue is one particularly, I think, that we also need to recognize this afternoon. Many of the organizations, including the ones that we spoke to when we did the study on principled humanitarian action in Iraq, pointed obviously to the security conditions. The lack of access, the fact that aid workers may be a target, access being denied by authorities, and so on. True, these are issues. But these issues should not lead to complacency. In fact, they should be an incentive for us to try harder. To try harder and to be in those areas where aid matters most. And this is particularly what I hope we will discuss this afternoon. We should examine, we as humanitarian organizations should examine how we deal, how we handle situations of risk. How we respond as organizations in terms of our institutional capacities, in terms of managing risk and addressing situations where people may be most in need. A few issues a little bit deeper. Let me explain them a little bit further here. In Iraq, and I would say, in fact, it's also an issue the other studies have highlighted, there's a great catchphrase used by many organizations. We deliver principled humanitarian action. That sounds good, but actually what does it mean? And we need to dig a level deeper to understand what actually delivering principled humanitarian action means. And in that sense, I already pointed to the principle of impartiality, this element of most in need, which apparently is a problem for many organizations. So we need to know, in that sense, what applying the principles actually entails. In the Iraq report, as such, we come to the conclusion that for organizations, when they say we deliver principled humanitarian action, what we actually want to see, particularly looking at it from the outside, looking at the organizations, we want to see evidence in on the way in which humanitarian organizations have taken the principles into account. To give you one example, when organizations are asked to work in camps and settlements where IDPs, particularly from the besieged cities and so on, where they come, they obviously at that moment are being screened for possible affiliation with ISIL. And some of these sites, in fact, are developed or will become, in fact, detention areas. That immediately then creates a question for humanitarian organizations. Do you work in those areas or not? And what do the humanitarian principles tell you in that context? Not all the principles point all the time in the same direction. What we want to see, what we're interested in that sense, particularly as researchers, perhaps it's not even perhaps the outcome of that question. Is it a yes or no in terms of working in the camps? But how did you, as organization, take into account the principles? And what we saw, in fact, in Iraq, but as for many organizations, they didn't necessarily have the principles in making these decisions. They didn't necessarily have the principles on the forefront of their mind. Second issue. Again, witnessed in Iraq, but I believe also an issue in other countries. We saw very few organizations that actually have made an investment in terms of their capacity to work in armed conflict. Many organizations nowadays have in fact security managers, people responsible for security. Interestingly, we saw very few organizations that, for instance, have an access manager. Now, I don't want to suggest here that everyone immediately should start appointing people covering access within the organizations as the answer to security. But obviously, there has to be a balance between security and access. Why do organizations put such a focus on security and actually very few nowadays, some of them in fact have started putting in place people responsible for access? I would say particularly it's a mindset issue. Not necessarily suggesting that, as I said, organizations start to appoint access coordinators, but at least that they make it on the forefront, a point that is on the forefront of their organizations. What we saw actually in Iraq also, and that was a concern certainly to us as researchers, is that in fact many of the organizations had outsourced much of their access negotiations to the UN. So they weren't necessarily looking themselves anymore in certain areas, they were actually leaving this to others to do it for them. So if you're working on the basis of a policy of acceptance, and you don't even go out anymore to see actually, can you enter an area, how would you actually expect that you're going to be accepted? Thirdly, another issue, and this is particularly when we thought about the recommendations. When we start thinking about the recommendations to make when we see these issues, in other reports, because some of these issues are not necessarily new, in other reports what we have seen, do more training on humanitarian principles, do more training on international humanitarian law, those sort of recommendations. I'm not saying those are not useful recommendations, but the question actually we need to ask ourselves is, if these were recommendations, let's say 5, 6 years ago, why actually are they still recommendations? Why are these issues still on the agenda and weren't they addressed actually already when they were first identified, for instance in the report Stay and Deliver, the next version of which will come out later this week. So in that sense, we need to look at some of the systemic problems, some of the institutional problems that apparently exist within the humanitarian community. What I'm not suggesting here is necessarily that we think of this in terms of donantist, so to speak, the classic traditional humanitarian organizations and those that are multi-mandate organizations. That would be perhaps even too easy to think in those terms. The question actually that we need to look at, I would suggest, in that sense is actually why do organizations concentrate their presence in areas where there's relatively, as I said, the areas that are relatively safe, and why do they not go out actually to the areas where perhaps they matter, where they matter most? I don't believe that that is an issue necessarily between, let's say, the donantist organizations and those organizations that let's say, are multi-mandate. I do think it's much more an issue in terms of how do we actually shift to emergency mode? How do we develop the capacity to negotiate access and to talk with the guys at checkpoints and so on? Lastly, and this is the question and the challenge for the panel. If there is a shared analysis around this, that these are real issues, then the question for me is particularly, and I hope panel that you will look at this, the question is, so what? What are we going to do about it? The next few days, the next several days, in fact, at the ECOSOC humanitarian segment, much of the discussion will be around the grand bargain, many of the themes related to the grand bargain, including the humanitarian development nexus, many of the resilience and many of those sort of issues. I'm not saying those are not important issues, but the question for me is, do they draw attention from the issues that we're raising here in these reports and that we hope to discuss today? I'll leave you with that. Julia, you can take it further.
I think it's excellent to come together, as Ed said. The body of evidence of the research is really starting to come together. As part of the SAVE project, we spent 3 years in 4 countries. We talked to over 2,000 aid workers, 4,000 people. Then there is the study you did with NRC. Then there is what MSF is doing, and there's more research coming out. And I think the really important issue is not just to ask, do we agree with the evidence that has been collected, but mainly, what do we do about it? And this is what we want to talk about today in this panel. So I'm very happy to be here and to have lots of people with a lot of operational experience on the panel with me to really unpack these findings. And I'd like to start with the question of what is the situation. Ed has already outlined it a little bit. This issue that the research finds that firstly, coverage is uneven, presence is uneven, and in the SAVE project we find that the strongest determinant statistically of presence is in fact insecurity, and insecurity for humanitarian workers, not insecurity for the population. And it's also insufficient. It's not only uneven, it's insufficient. So let's start with an NGO. Raquel, you are with MSF. You are MSF's Director of Operations, I understand, with the Barcelona-Athens Operations Center. I think you've spent over 20 years now with the organization, managing emergency responses in a whole lot of different settings. So I think very good, well positioned to let us know a little bit these research findings. I mean, do they reflect your experiences in the field?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, we started by that. No? You were saying there is no need to state the obvious, but yes, there is still need to state the obvious. There is a gap. We are not saying that the gap didn't exist before. We are not saying that it's getting bigger or smaller. What we say is that, particularly in which concerns the capacity of the system to scale up an operation in the early stages of a crisis, to respond in an emergency mode to a conflict. There is a huge problem of the ability of the system, all of us actors included in this system, to provide timely and critical assistance to the people in need. We had to go through a number of forums and discuss with a number of people to get this acknowledged. And indeed, one of the things we are saying to some of those actors is just state the gap. I mean, your initial responsibility is to say that what we are doing is not sufficient. What MSF is saying now it comes from an old report that you might have heard of, Where is Everyone? That was very much of a hustle in the humanitarian work, but also is an elaboration of what we said when we decided to withdraw from the World Humanitarian Summit. We were very disappointed because the system was, during the World Humanitarian Summit, endorsing a path of how to deal with the humanitarian consequences of conflict that was basically approaching transition from acute to protracted conflict, and that was belittling the importance of keeping some muscle, some ability to respond to surge in emergency response in some settings. So this reaction, I mean, we have been elaborating on this statement. And we have provided a number of case studies that prove that the experience that our team was transmitting. I mean, this situation in which you go to a refugee camp recently set and you say there is no coordination, there is no water, there are enormous difficulties to address basic needs of population, despite the fact that many people are claiming to be there somewhat, doing some kind of assistance, but likely not addressing the most critical ones. Beyond our natural observation and the field observation of our teams, we have substantiated that with a number of case studies, particularly in the Sahel, which is where we felt most this gap over the last couple of years. And then we have offered as an internal reflection a number of papers elaborating on what we think are the reasons why the situation is what it is. Security is one, but security also can be a very natural excuse, when you don't have the right mindset to go for it. So we're pointing out at systemic issues, at mindset issues, at the fact that there is nothing in the current ideological and policy frame guiding humanitarian response that tell us that this is right to invest in conflict settings, is right to take risk and to go for the most difficult places. The whole system is disencouraging organizations from investing there through a number of mechanisms. The fact that most of organizations have just handed over the security management in the hands of United Nations, their negotiation capacities in United Nations agencies, and that they have not enough financial independence to go for their own choices, make the whole system unresponsive. So yes, it perfectly matches our field experience.
May I add or ask another question, which is, Ed was speaking a lot about the humanitarian principles and especially the principle of impartiality and our difficulty sort of complying with it or living it. You mentioned that it's not just insecurities, a lot of systemic incentives and so on. What are the consequences of all these factors coming together for impartiality? Are we able in certain areas still to have an impartial response, or do we have system failure on impartiality?
If you look at the major crisis, I mean, none of us is able to assist populations in IS control areas. None of us is able to assist populations in Boko Haram control areas. So there are big gaps, black holes of needs of humanity, of human suffering, to which the humanitarian system, and this includes MSF, is not able to reach and to provide assistance. And even when situation is not that bad, and this was the case in Yemen, even when access was possible, the system was refusing to go there and to engage and taking more risks to provide assistance. So what we create is a situation in which we are not present, organizations are not present, so it's much more difficult to build negotiated access because you don't have direct engagement with local actors, and you are not providing the right services to the right people, to the people most in need, which at the end have an enormous reputational impact of the humanitarian system, and we start being perceived as less relevant, as less important, and then why granted access to the most difficult areas. So I think that we will have to deal with the fact that because of this course of action and integrated agendas of United Nations and coherent agendas and all this is just creating an environment in which providing assistance to this particular population in the most hot spots and difficult to access places is becoming more and more difficult.
Jamie, not Mats. You are, as Ed said, the director of NRC's Geneva office, but also head of humanitarian policy. And I think in addition to that, or building that on a lot of operational experience, especially in Afghanistan, Pakistan, you told me, but also Myanmar and Rakhine. So some of the areas where we face some of these issues in a very acute way. Raquel just said we have these black holes somewhere where we fail to deliver assistance. What is your sense? Is this sort of a pattern that you see repeating all over the world, or do we have differences by region, differences by situation, I don't know, differences by organization perhaps as well?
Well, I think there's a lot going on there, right? So I would totally agree that there is a sense in which we are looking at utilizing insecurity as an excuse not to leave capitals. That we see black holes, they deviate and they change based on circumstances and time. So it also, to a certain extent, looks at what Ed was mentioning earlier, and that is about where do agencies see their expectations around risk tolerance, and risk management. And I think by looking at the humanitarian sector, we're looking at very different actors. So we have a spectrum. When MSF brought out Where Is Everyone, it was everyone is supposed to be with MSF? No, because we have different tools in our toolkit. Different agencies are there to do different things. NRC, for instance, I hope I can say this clearly, that NRC perceives itself to be closer to MSF than it does to perhaps other multi-mandated agencies that are less willing to take on certain risks. So I think it's a spectrum of issues that are in place. And if we look at the areas where Raquel was mentioning, Boko Haram, if we look at southern Yemen, if we look at South Sudan right now, outside of Juba, if we look outside of different areas which are easily accessible, you may find more actors, but they're going to be sparse on the ground where it is hard to reach. And I am not a huge fan of the term hard to reach, because in fact it doesn't give us anything that is of substance when we're talking about people's vulnerabilities. And so it's a combination of lots of different areas. I think one of the big things that we often neglect to look at is agencies often rely on their increasing levels of risk aversion, not risk tolerance, because they say, oh, our donors won't allow us. Actually, if you have conversations with your donors, there is an opportunity for you to have dialogue and increase the question of risk, because the donors are there to, as we know with ECHO, for example, we can have discussions on alternative procedures to report in areas where we can't get compliance on other forms of procurement, logistics concerns. Those things that some agencies, I should caveat that, say that these are reasons why they would love to go to Boko Haram areas, but they can't because their donors wouldn't allow them and they couldn't guarantee compliance. There's a certain bit of that that's true, but the negotiations that you have with donors comes down to the trust of donors. And I think that we're looking at the spectrum of agencies within a humanitarian context, and in 2017, we can't say all humanitarians are going to go off and be able to perform at the same level in the same areas. And we have to be honest with that. Ed brought up the other issue, which is whether or not this is new. I certainly don't think there is anything new about the new way of working. But that is often now used as not as an excuse, but as an example of how we're going to do other bits of a humanitarian response and leave the hard-to-reach areas to those like MSF and ICRC and hopefully NRC. So I think there's a combination of rationalities that agencies are talking or projecting amongst their own dialogue that really give us this dispersity of where we go and where we don't go. I mean, it's somewhat easy for me. I've been in Geneva for now 1.5 years, and before that I was based in Bangkok. So I haven't been to a hard-to-reach area since 2014. So I'm maybe also a product of that. So I can sit in Bangkok and I can talk about the challenges, and I can talk about how certain agencies maybe should go further. But it's also, I'm sitting in Geneva, I'm not sitting in Medjugorje trying my best to get out and negotiating with armed groups and not getting anywhere, and the frustration levels that might bring about, and dealing with your own agencies, security advisors and others in head office saying, well, our donors wouldn't accept that. What are you going to do about it?
A lot of this, the results of that are about perceptions, and I think there's one piece of research we haven't mentioned yet, which is done by Geneva Call, which is called In Their Words, which looks, I think, crucially at what perceptions non-state armed groups have of all this. Now, I wonder from, even if you have been a little bit removed from the hard-to-reach areas, what's your sense about the current picture? What effect does it have on the perceptions these actors have? Is this a sort of a uniform thing where all the perceptions of all humanitarians suffer, or are people differentiating a lot between the different types of humanitarian?
I also think that I think that if we send the wrong people out without the skill sets to actually negotiate access properly, it does us all damage, right? So we have to be able to say, yes, sometimes we rely on a humanitarian system which has a few humanitarian negotiators that are out there doing that job on behalf of a community because they have the right skills to do it. But I remember also when MSF had brought out the report on Where Is Everyone, at that time I was working for OCHA, and the argument was, wait, we're also doing it, but in a different way. And the morality of saying, what is it that we really want to achieve? And that comes back down to many of our colleagues who are actually negotiating with armed groups, where they're saying, we're not here on behalf of all NGOs, we're here on behalf of us, because we can only ensure that we're going to also work with you to remain neutral, to remain impartial, to show that we are here for the benefit of those that are most vulnerable. But I can't guarantee that the people coming behind me are going to be doing the same thing. So we have to be honest as well that we can't speak on behalf of a whole system unless, of course, we give that over to something like OCHA or CivMil coordination or security training. So it does come down to the differentiation. If we look for South Sudan right now, I think we'd be hard-pressed to find a situation where armed groups, irrespective of what colors they are wearing, don't see us all as the same thing. Right now, I remember when I was working in South Sudan, they used to say, what tribe do you belong to in Canada? And I had to really think, ooh, what is it? How do I describe to these people what my background is so that they can understand what I do in order for me to get my team's access? So there's lots of things that we struggle with all the time, and I think it is deviations and differences that we rely on. MSF's ability to do it is going to be different than mine, and be different from ICRC, and be different from OCHA, etc. So I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all.
Yeah. Maybe one brief element from the research we have done which speaks to that is that when we spoke to populations, and we spoke to over 4,000 people, and we asked them whether they perceive the risk that humanitarians face, so that whether they understand why there is no one, and they did not generally perceive that risk. They all said, no, it's safe for you to work here. So that's interesting for that perception. Let me come to you, Nicola. So you are from the ICRC, strategic advisor to the Director of Operations at the moment, but that also comes on top of a long career at ICRC, where you said you've been a little bit all over the place, from the Americas to the Middle East to a bit of Africa and a bit of Asia. Of course, we always want to know from the ICRC how the principles translate into practice. And I think it's very interesting what Jamie just said about the negotiation skills, and Ed brought this out earlier as well, is how much do the principles really infuse things like negotiation in practice?
Well, they're absolutely key. At least for us, they are key. I mean, for us, they are the recipes for gaining access, gaining proximity, and doing it in a more or less safe environment. Abiding by the principles basically allows us to work where we are. I mean, our biggest operations are Syria, it's Iraq, it's South Sudan, it's Nigeria. So we still remain convinced that, okay, yeah, the principles are key. They allow us to get access, and they allow us to get precisely where it matters. The important issue about the principles here is probably the fact that you have to invest in them. You can't just come in and say, okay, I'm neutral, I'm independent, I'm a good one, and that's it. You have to invest. You have to repeat the message. You have to reach out. You have to reach out to the state in order to have the authority to work. You have to reach out to non-state armed groups because, okay, they control territory, they might let you in or not. And you have to reach out to the community. The community is key. If they get the message that you're a humanitarian, that you're not taking sides, that you're here for them, they will pass the message and it will make it much easier for you to work. But this means you have to invest. You have to invest resources. You have to be perseverant. You have to accept backlashes. It will not always work out and so on. But it's not something that you do one day and then the next day maybe something else and so on. It doesn't really work like that. Maybe just two issues that make it more difficult today to abide by the principles, to get this access and acceptance. One is fragmentation. Some recent studies show us that in the past 6 years, more armed groups have been formed than in the preceding 60 years combined. So that's a huge proliferation of actors. That's a huge proliferation. It's one thing to negotiate with the LTTE in Sri Lanka. That's like, one body and, who calls the shots and they're organized and so on. It's quite another issue to negotiate with dozens of different actors in order to get to a besieged area in Syria. You don't know these people. They change. They change allegiance. Do they have chains of command that function or don't they? You don't really know. And you have to add probably one other factor which is quite important here is increasing criminalization. You have splinter groups. They pursue their own objectives. They're here today and gone tomorrow. Some are in the drugs business. Others are people smuggler, mineral exploitation. You name it, and you have to engage with them as well because they also control access. They are also relevant for your security. You have to be accepted by them as well as a humanitarian actor who doesn't take sides, who's here for the population. But if you combine this fragmentation with the increasing criminalization, you get a mixture which is more explosive, which is more dangerous, which is more risky. Does that mean the principles are not applicable anymore? No, on the contrary. On the contrary. But it becomes sometimes more difficult. And you have to factor in these elements when you do your analysis, when you take the decisions, okay, do I go in, do I speak with this one or that one, and so on and so on and so on. So increasingly difficult.
And so far we've been speaking about the principles largely as that one thing, right? And of course we all know it's not one thing, it's several principles, and sometimes the relationship between them is not that straightforward either. Just a quick, not a 1 hour lecture, just a quick point from your side. Is there a hierarchy between these principles? Are there some that are particularly important for that practical matter of gaining access?
Okay. I'll spare you the hour, but no, I mean, the key is humanity, that's for sure. That's why we're out there. We're there for the people. We're there for the person that is suffering from armed conflict. Second one, impartiality is simply non-negotiable. It's in international humanitarian law stipulated that it has to be, the aid that you deliver has to be impartial. You cannot be humanitarian while giving or servicing the beneficiaries according to their political affiliations, to their religious beliefs and so on. You're not humanitarian anymore. You have a political agenda, you're a different actor. So impartiality is non-negotiable. One that I find always needs a lot of investment, a lot of efforts is neutrality. You are in a conflict situation is so polarized that when you come in there and you say you're neutral, you're not taking sides, that's very difficult to understand by by the different parties. If you're not with me, you're against me, and all these kind of issues, it comes up very quickly. So neutrality really needs reaffirmation, it needs efforts, it needs constant passing of the correct messages, and it informs your communication. You can't just communicate as you deem fit and so on. You have to factor in, okay, what is going to be the perception? Because you mentioned it, perception is key. It's how they see you abiding by the principles, respecting the principles. So neutrality, definitely an important one, a difficult one.
Great. Now we also have two donors here on the panel. One is Irene from the German Foreign Office, where she is in the Division for Humanitarian Assistance, and previously was with NATO and in a range of different countries that all have also humanitarian issues: Lebanon, Afghanistan, Morocco, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. We also have from ECHO Hervé Delphin, who's head of unit for humanitarian and crisis response in the European neighborhood, Middle East, Central and Southwestern Asia, I believe is the geographic split you have. Now, we're very interested, of course, in your reading of this situation. I think we heard fairly different ways of characterizing this. It goes from impartiality is non-negotiable to we have system failure and we're not able to deliver impartially. Irene, may I ask you, how do you see this? How much of an issue are we facing in your perspective?
I think in our perspective as a donor, it's a huge issue. It's the access issue. And for us, it's such a prominent issue that we have actually made it the topic of one of the panels of the ECOSOC this year, because we want to look at this from a humanitarian perspective and better understand what actually we can do about it. I also have to say that you spoke about our operational experiences in the beginning. My operational experience in this case is that of a ministry person who happens to work for a large donor. And as such, I think the first thing I want to say is when somebody says donors won't allow us, at least for us, that is not true. That is not a factor at all for us as a donor. As a donor, we see those, what did you call it, black holes? And of course, we don't like them. We want to bring light and help bring light into those black holes. And as a donor, what you do is to finance people who want to do that. So from our side, there is no restriction at all. There's no clause in our paperwork that says, but not if it's dangerous. Yeah, there are, of course, security provisions for our own employees, I'm sorry to say, for embassy people, for example, but there's no clause whatsoever that says it's dangerous, we won't fund you. So yeah, black holes are a problem. No, it's not that we are not funding anybody who wants to go in there. We have been thinking about this from another point of view, because that's of course not true for every situation, but for some where you have problems of access and where there is a government with which you can negotiate, because humanitarian aid is not the only point of contact between one government and another government. There's usually many other points of contact. There may be development aid, there may be trade relations, there may be other things, maybe even security arrangements. So I think for a donor who's part of a government, it would make much more sense to see what other of those relations that you have in such a context might be used for leverage to free up access. Of course, that is not valid for all these constellations that you have described, but it might work in some. So that's, yeah. That's what we are thinking about.
Just one follow-up on that. There is this, seems to be this curious misunderstanding sometimes between donors and implementers, where you do hear a lot, donors won't allow us. So, and clearly, you know, there seems to be the opposite reaction. So I'm just quite interested in finding out, in practice, what is it that you as a donor now, as Germany, do in order to make the implementers understand what risks they can take, how you will back them up in these very difficult situations?
We will not necessarily be able to back them up other than financially. I mean, it is probably nobody wants any government to send in the troops if there's a humanitarian who's in danger. Yeah, so there is institutional limits. But actually, I wanted to add one aspect which you actually briefly touched upon already. So while we have no holes, only because it's dangerous, we need an organization that wants to go there. Without somebody who wants to implement a project, what are we going to do with the money? Yeah. So the first thing is somebody who wants to go there. Because as a donor, you don't walk around and hold up a wad of money and say, can please somebody take it and go there? Yeah. So the first step usually comes from the organization, and if there is no first step, as a donor, you are stumped. And the other thing I wanted to say, because you touched upon it in a way, if you have areas with actors like ISIL or Boko Haram, there is a problem for donors when it comes to all those interdictions of terrorism financing. Yeah, because there's a lot of international legislation out there now that makes it, that imposes, let's say, controls on whom you finance, and even down to who the partner organizations on the ground are. And I think none of us yet has a complete picture of what that actually does. But we are kind of worried about it. We know that the NRC is worried about it. We know that the ICRC is worried about it. And I think the Belgians, so we are kind of a small group looking into this.
Hervé, let me turn to you and ask you a similar question, sort of from ECHO's perspective. What kind of discussions do you have internally? What kind of attention is being given to this issue of, you know, an uneven coverage, some black holes we have heard? And do you believe that we have kind of the right level of political attention as well on the issue?
I'm one of those European bureaucrats, so it may sound like, you know, I'm out of place in this this area, where in this building of humanitarian assistance. I happen to be maybe an unusual humanitarian bureaucrat by having had some experience in humanitarian assistance in West Africa. I was many times visiting Sierra Leone, Liberia, or the Sahel at the time of the first Tuareg rebellion, and I've been a couple of times in Syria lately, and I'm just back from Iraq, and I was in West Mosul. And all this to say is that I think we have to approach the topic with both reality and humility. Reality is that the report that is a basis for the discussion that's been supported financially by ECHO is just to bring another piece in a wider body of evidence as to what reality means in terms of humanitarian assistance. And I think there have been many good reports, those done by MSF and Stay and Deliver. And I think we're just piling up evidence, and I think we should always remain focused on reality, what's happening on the ground, just to avoid the, I would say, the hubris of a discussion where it turns into either ideological or with a moral high ground, a moral high standing. I don't think it's what it is about here. And also some humility in relation to the fact that these topics are not new, and happen also to teach the College of Europe on humanitarian assistance. And
reading through the biography, you find books dating back to 98. It was called from Jonathan Moore, called Hard Choices, Moral Dilemmas in Humanitarian Intervention. So who are we? We keep on revisiting the same topic time and again, and I think it is healthy because each time, each period brings its new dynamics and new challenges. So I think we have to keep that in mind and not believe that each time we rediscover a reality, the reality changes, and we need to stay tuned to this reality. And also, I think it's important to have these kind of discussions, these reports, as a tool of mutual accountability, both for each of us as organizations, either donor or humanitarian organizations, and collectively as part of the humanitarian system. I think bringing this accountability, the honesty of a debate on those topics, I think is important because it's too easy to placate principles as a sort of facade and not really dig into what it means in practice. And to answer your question, I would say that for ECHO, I could take two hands. One is, yes, we have the European Consensus 2007 and put the humanitarian principle at the core. That helped to bring the humanitarian principles also in the treaty, the Lisbon Treaty. But I also would like to bring it to what we do in Iraq, for example. When we designed our first implementation plans, what we call our strategy, operational strategy, from the beginning we put humanitarian assistance and principle at the core. And we brought the community, humanitarian community, several times in Brussels to discuss these issues, not just on the what we do, but how we do it. And the how we do it matters a lot. And it's not only to gain acceptance, to gain access, but also the impact and the lasting effect of what we do. Because each time we can do, I fix it and I forget, it has implications. It has an impact from one crisis to another, or even in the same crisis from a period to another. So I think we even put at the time in 2015, attached to one of the background papers, we said not just any money. It's not just as a donor. We just give the money like this. It is not just any money. It's money with principles attached to it. And I think it's important to recognize these elements. So in all what has been said, I mean, recognizing from MSF the gaps in the system or how we manage risk, how basically we are trading, or are we trading between different principles? I think there is no good answer. There is no wrong answer. There is always, each time, we have to make choices. And I think it's, at least we have to be aware of those choices and maybe be more open about it. And I think this is why we're trying to bring this on the public place, like through this report. It is really a way of doing it. We intend to work and to follow up on this report. Because I think it's important to make it something concrete that brings practices and different partners around the table, and maybe to distill this into practical recommendations. And I've seen that the next report on presence and proximity basically draws the conclusions that after 5 years of stay and deliver, there are still recommendations that have not been delivered upon. And even when at HQ we deliver the toolbox of practical solutions, it still does not really translate effectively in the ground. So, we should ask ourselves why? Where's the problem? So I think we're on a joint endeavor in that. And I would just finish just to highlight from ECHO perspective in Iraq, from the very beginning we look at, precisely to avoid gaps, pre-funding of pre-positioning and preparedness of actors, anticipating the future battles. From Tikrit onwards to Ramadi, Fallujah, up to Mosul, our role, we felt, was to enable our partners to put the money up front, to anticipate the battles. And I think that was what happened to anticipate the movement of IDPs. And I think that was one first duty we saw as a donor. The second was to recognize the importance to invest on the principles and IHL. And that's the reason why we have a rather large palette of partners that complement each other. So we've got Geneva Call, who's Mehmet is here, ICRC, OCHA, HCR, each of them covering one aspect of the, I would say, the principal response, whether looking at the dissemination of IHL, the protection of civilians, and I think that was for us one axis. One that is probably not invested enough collectively, and we recognize that, and I think a lot should be done, is risk management, risk awareness and risk management. We were forthcoming when partners, and discussion with partners, on how they could, for example, finance heat training for their own staff, you know, hostile environment training. But I think more could be done, and there are issues that are deep and profound and complex, like duty of care. What for the staff, humanitarian staff, are the donors ready to pay the premium of the risk attached to risk? I think that's an important question, one which has not been really put on the table. It should be put on the table. And the last point is really also building on the civil-military coordination. I think when you are dealing with complex emergencies, by definition, you've got military and humanitarian actors on the ground. They each have their own mandate, but they have to work together, or at least talk to each other, know what their respective roles and complementarity are. We also looked at that in the Iraq case as an important issue that we need to invest. Did we do enough? I don't know. Maybe others can comment on that. But I think we recognize this as a key issue. All this to say, to finish, that, yeah, humanitarian principles remain a main driver for our action. It was, I would say, written down into our operational strategies from the beginning, and we still believe that they need to be labeled, informed by evidence, and by discussion and disagreements. Because I think, again, no one can have the ultimate truth on that.
Thank you, Hervé, for not just preaching that we should act on the evidence, but also practicing at the same time and already showing, you know, in very, very concrete ways what this can look like. I would like to take up this challenge and put it on to the rest of the panel. Because we have a long list of factors that have come up already that we know are important, and really look at these elements and ask, what is it that we can do about it? What is it that you have done about it, so that we can learn for it? I'd like to start with you, Nicolas, and ask you about negotiation skills. I think you mentioned it before. This obviously is important. It's not just who we send, but also are they equipped with the necessary things to negotiate with different and maybe fragmented parties. How are we looking? Do we have sufficient capacity? What can be done to improve this?
I can't speak for others. I mean, for us, it remains key that we have the skills, that we have the means to actually engage in negotiations on access with all different parties. I mean, we want to be at the front line. We want to engage with all the different parties, and then, okay, the guiding principles are the principles, basically, that allow us to get the trust that we need in order to work in these areas. Maybe just a few points on I'd like to share here. One is the importance of local staff. I think it's often a bit overlooked when we talk about security management and security training and so on, that there is also local staff. And what can they bring in? They can bring in the history of the context. Very often they've been around for 10, 20 years. We delegates, we go in, we go out, we go to the next place and so on. They stay, and they have the memory. They know who we dealt with. They know about the cultural sensitivities. They know that 4 years ago with this community we did this training, and that one received this kind of assistance. And that's just so important, because we are observed out there. The communities that observe us, the non-state armed groups, they observe us. So you have to know what you did in the past. And you will never know it unless, I mean, you're not going to read all the reports. You can't. So you have your local staff with you. And I think that's really, really important to give them the credit that they deserve, because they can really guide us in very volatile, very dangerous environments. The second point is a bit about networking, and I'll start with internal networking. I think there is more and more contexts that do not stop at the borders anymore, that are spilling over the most classic cases, the Lake Chad Basin, where you have Nigeria, Niger, Chad, Northern Cameroon. They're all embroiled a bit in this conflict. And for us in ICRC, it's really important that, okay, we work horizontally. Not really used to that. We usually go like the delegation, the size. We have to work across borders. We have to connect the dots between the different delegations. I think that's really key, and it's becoming ever more important the more these conflicts have spillover effects, affect neighboring countries, be it only through the movement of population. And then the second one, very much linked to that, is the external networking, of course. Networking delegates who have the skills, the capacity, the means to reach out to everybody, to pass the relevant messages, to connect the dots, to share then with other delegations, with other people in the same delegation, what is going on and so on. I think that's really important, because we don't have this environment anymore where you have a clearly confined conflict that takes place within certain regions, within one country and so on. We have to move beyond that, and there it's really important that we have the means to do so and the willingness to do so.
Akel, the issue of risk aversion I would like to put to you again. It came up so much, and again, you know, Hervé mentioned duty of care in particular. What are ways to deal with it, to improve our performance on risk aversion, become more risk friendly?
It's difficult because each of us are dealing with different issues. Now we feel much less under pressure by the counterterrorism frame, because we found our own operations in a private manner. So we think that more or less we can manage this frame in a good manner. I think that this is a huge constraint, no, for many organizations. I think that dealing with this kind of institutional risk is becoming a problem well beyond all the issues of accountability and so on. I mean, this is the real elephant in the room for many organizations. We are not dealing with this problem. I think that's MSF, in my opinion, and this is because I'm just about to finish in my current position, and after seeing the evolution of even MSF over the last 6 years, I can perceive a certain increase in risk aversion. We are also in the margins of many of the most important crises. Whereas because we have had to absorb a number of security incidents over the last few years, and that requires a lot of institutional resilience to cope with and adaptations, not to be made in terms of what more risk you can take, what more incidents you can suffer. So you need to test your own ability, institutional ability to absorb this kind of incidents, and there is a lot of work being done to try to decrease, to mitigate risk. And we mitigate risk in many ways by resorting to models of operations that were against MSF dogma of being present in the field with international presence always. And so there have been an evolution in our organization towards some of those risks. Duty of care is a particularly difficult one, but it's true that we as states we operate in conflict zones. We do our best to make sure that we provide the best tools to our and the best frame for our staff to manage to run their operations, to do their work in a safe manner. But we're always very explicit in the sense that there is a residual risk in some of those places, and we state openly that we are a risk-taking organization in that sense. And I think that this is very important, that there is no way to fully mitigate risk when you are operating in insecure areas. Whereas it's risk related with diversion of goods, or whereas it's because you are not performing well enough in terms of the quality of your assistance, or whereas you accept that you as an individual, as an institution, are accepting the fact that you might suffer incidents in a certain setting, is something that our organizations need to state clearly if they want to change their mindset and go for it.
And I think you're putting your finger right on a pretty wound spot, which is there can be compromises involved. And in fact, our research showed that there always are compromises involved, but we rather don't talk about them, you know, be it diversion, be it changing your targeting criteria. If you work in these environments, very, very tough choices come up inevitably. And I want to put this question to you, Jamie. How do you go about handling these compromises, both internally, perhaps, but also in conversation with others, other operational agencies, and perhaps also the donors?
I'll take the external one first, because it's a little bit easier for us to describe who we are as NRC, and without giving the organizational mantra. I can say one of the things that we try to do most importantly is that NRC is there to learn lessons, to make mistakes, but to share those experiences across the sector. So one of the key identity issues is we want to be seen as a convener on the questions of principles as they're being challenged in the field by our teams. So we do share that on a regular basis externally. We have those conversations with our donors. Last year we worked hard with ECHO to look particularly at how do we develop a set of alternative procedures in areas around Syria where there's no way that we can be compliant with the agreement that we signed 2 years ago, with the agreement we signed last year, because we know that the situation is changing. Conflict lines change, and as a result, who is control of that area that used to be maybe government controlled is no longer government controlled. It's not also in situations in Syria, for example, where we have to describe to our peers a lot is yeah, we negotiate with whoever is in control of that area that we need to try to get access to. Sometimes in Syria, we have to be honest that NRC is working with partners to get access, not for strategic reasons, but it's about the honesty of that. So the compromising that you make with your principles is not compromising the principle, it's how do we achieve the ultimate goal, recognizing that we're going to have to make a step in one direction, but we're trying to supplement that some way. Internally, the discussion is much more difficult, I think, because as an organization, you have an identity and you're trying to share that in many ways. We do a lot of cross-fertilization learning. So last week we had a big report that came out on protection of civilian sites in South Sudan, looking primarily about how to integrate missions, in our example, in working as a co-clustered lead for protection, looking at how do we design a situation where we can live with the realities of working inside of a POC site. There in South Sudan, it's a very interesting example because the military is completely in control, for instance, of water distribution. How do we then say, what is it that they're trying to do by controlling the distribution of water? It's actually about controlling the calmness or punishing those that are not so calm in different parts of the POC site. And we're trying to say, this is not a humanitarian outcome. You cannot act in a way that you're withholding people's right to a good in order to achieve something for a military compromise. And then what do we as a humanitarian do? Do we leave? Do we stop working? Well, we can. So we have to then say, okay, it's back to the drawing board. So when we talk about negotiations in difficult areas, it can also be the negotiating with what we should be seeing as allies. In this case, the peacekeepers. So I think there's a lot of issues there. And how do we learn lessons? One of the things that's come up, and you've heard it a lot, is that there's this report, that report. In 2 days' time, we're releasing the presence and proximity report. Indeed, this is 6 years on from Stay and Deliver, but it's actually 5 years since we finished the report, because it took us the last 11 months to get sign-off from our colleagues at OCHA, from our colleagues at head office, and from our colleagues within the DSS. So and it's all around the language that we use. How do we ensure that we're not going to, by publishing a report, put people at the operational level at jeopardy? There's no way that Boko Haram is going to read presence and proximity. So our internal learnings have to be about, let's take it seriously. We're putting a lot of reports out. Are we actually learning the lessons from those reports internally? And this is something that agencies like those sitting on the table and those in the audience are probably struggling with internally. I think it's much easier for us to have within, let's say, cross-sectorial discussions than it is actually having discussions between one country office and another country office on how they challenge each other on the principles and the application of them.
Let's bring a donor perspective in on the culture of silence. Hervé, if I may, from your perspective, is there such a thing as a culture of silence on the compromises, the very uncomfortable things that can be involved when dealing with the principles? And if so, how do you deal with it? How can you encourage organizations to overcome it?
There is a moment where obviously we exchange about this, maybe not necessarily specific context related, so that may ease the discussion. When we have discussions related to a context, is how we conduct it publicly or or privately. When we do it publicly, obviously we have to be careful that it is no harm to the people on the ground. I think that's clearly a red line. I think again there is nothing to hide. There is really nothing to hide in this kind of discussions. Since for us, I would say partners' red lines, and I'm talking now about, for example, the case of Syria. We've kept on repeating just across the board when I usually go on this Thursday when the Humanitarian Task Force of the ICRC meets, that please give the space and the time for humanitarian organizations to do their work properly. So for us, it's a matter of putting that on the table when around the table you've got mostly politicians and diplomats, so that they realize that there are basic issues and basic elements that must be respected so that humanitarians can do their work, and rather than being instrumentalized for wider political reasons. In the context of Iraq, we have also really had this discussion in many layers with partners, discussing what is feasible, what is not feasible, and I want to insist, as a donor, our first duty is not to push partners beyond the limit, doing things that they should normally not do. And I think that would be totally irresponsible if a donor were to do this. And I think for me, it's an ethical question that, I mean, if a donor were to trespass that line, I would seriously question the nature of this donor in terms of, after all, like Germany, we are many to be linked to the good humanitarian donorship, and I think this is one key element here. I think again in relation to the application of principles and the compromises, we had this discussion, and indeed Jamie mentioned it in the case of Syria, where basically we had our standards of accountability as a donor. We're responsible. We have to report to our scrutiny authorities on the use of budget, public money. So if our partners are not in a situation to report exactly according to the standards of accountability, shall we penalize them? In the case of Syria, we took Syria basically as a case study, and we try to work around. Can we find other ways of ensuring monitoring and accountability from a donor's perspective while not impeding the work of partners? And that's what we found. So we piloted the same way our remote management experience has been piloted in different crises. And again, it's enabling our partners to do their work. Our duty as a donor, again, is towards the beneficiaries, towards the partners, and also always towards the scrutiny bodies that we have. So as long as we can explain what we do, I think it's important. Just a little anecdote. I had a meeting with Jean Arthuis, who is the chairman of the European Parliament Committee for Budget. And he said, get real. There cannot be things like no risk in humanitarian aid. And we know that. So putting it on the table came from someone dealing with the budget. So it's interesting. And he said, what matters, he says, is transparency and explanation about the choices you have to make. And I think that summarizes it. And again, when we do remote management, that raises a lot of issues. You mentioned, Nicolas, about working with local partners. Again, there is a discussion out there on localization. And I think the humanitarian system is only as strong as the last mile, as the last link. And often, These are local organizations. How can we build the capacity? So, for example, ECHO in Iraq or in Syria, we provided money to humanitarian partners to help build this capacity, because otherwise the system is not solid. So it's also recognition that by doing so, we not only rely on the ability of these organizations, but also to bring the conversations on principles, how they can respect principles, how they are not taking undue risk. So all these discussions are on the table, and I think, at least from ECHO's perspective, these are issues we've been dealing with, but we are trying to find concrete solutions to these issues.
Irene, you said you have made sure in ECOSOC there will be a session on access, which is fabulous. But I think in a lot of people's mind, when you look at the global debate at the moment on where are there changes in the humanitarian system, the main things you see are grand bargain and all the different things that fall under grand bargain, and these do not include principles or access. You see the new way of working, perhaps. You see things about the financing gap, but it's not there in a very prominent way. So I wanted to ask, is there, beyond adding something to the ECOSOC discussion, is there a need for this overall debate to somehow shift and have a step change, very much in line with MSF's actual initial criticism of the World Humanitarian Summit, that it's sort of looking at the wrong things. Do you concur with that?
I'm not sure that my answer is going in the right direction. If it's not, pull me back. Well, I think for the results of the World Humanitarian Summit and the Grand Bargain, I think something that we are starting to understand now as donors is, because we've been very wrapped up in all these debates, the nexus debate and the gap and closing it, but I think it's starting to emerge that doesn't quite reflect the realities on the ground. It's basically quite it's a political debate game in our circles, if I may say so. But it hasn't yet really trickled down to anything that's happening at the level of the RCs, HCs. So what's really happening on the ground is I'm not sure if people there know that there's been a World Humanitarian Summit or that they feel it. Probably not, as far as we can see. So, but a different thing is the access question, because that for us is very much associated with the respect for international humanitarian law. And I think here you do not have that gap, because wherever you debate it, it's a good debate and it's a necessary debate. So we want to look at this access thing also very much through the lens of how do you gain more respect for international humanitarian law. What can you do to promote the safety of humanitarian workers by talking about also maybe the legal framework and the basis that it has. And may I add a fun detail? Via a provision of our constitution, international humanitarian law is directly German law. So we can't even walk away from it if we wanted to.
Great, thank you. So let me bring in the vast experience and thoughts that are assembled here. Any comments, any questions you have on this broad array of subjects relating to principles and access that we have been discussing?
Good evening. My name is Ivo Vrijsen, head of office with OCHA Iraq. And let me start by thanking the panelists for their interventions and contributions to the debate. Maybe not immediately a question, but some further reflections. First of all, we obviously share the concern about the black holes. I think we need to collectively conclude that if we would have liked to have a different situation, we should perhaps have invested in different methodologies in terms of interacting with the other side of the conflict. In the context of West Mosul, that is obviously now too late. So we have this black hole situation and a very uncomfortable feeling that as humanitarians, of course, we all have about the plight of civilians caught up in these conditions. The good news, however, is that we continue to see that there are agencies, operational actors that are willing to get as close as possible to the black holes. So I would like to first of all caution a too blanket perhaps description as to risk aversion having become something of epidemic or endemic and subsequently epidemic proportions across the humanitarian sector. I think we need to drill down as to who is affected most by these tendencies. Do we see perhaps shifts of certain actors that we used to see in or close to the front line stepping back and other actors stepping forward? And in preparing for this event, I asked my colleagues dealing with West Mosul to actually print me the list of organizations currently working at muster points, which is the first point where IDPs, where we have the ability to reach out to IDPs coming out of West Mosul. And I have to admit, 80% of the acronyms I had not seen before. It's a mix of national organizations, regional organizations, and some international, mainstream household names, but they are the minority. Is that a bad development? I'm not so sure. They're there, they're providing assistance. At the same time, we see larger mainstream actors, if I can call them that way, indeed dealing with these very large IDP camps and emergency sites. We're actually very happy that we have DRC and NRC and others doing that, because let's not make the mistake to think that these locations are not highly charged, extremely sensitive, heavily militarized, i.e. settings where you really want to make sure you have partners who can withstand related pressures, the negotiations, and so on and so forth. What we have done as OCHA is trying to be as forward-leaning as possible through a very large SIMCORT team. That would be, for me, again, one of the basic recommendations. Don't underinvest, overinvest in SIMCORT. It's very labor-intensive to ensure that you have the ability to field teams on nearly a daily basis to these newly retaken areas. Because that's the approach. We want to be there as soon as possible with operational actors who are perhaps part of the coalition of the willing, or debrief them and ensure that they subsequently follow up through operational response after the SIMCORT missions have taken place. It is indeed also, it has developed in a little bit of a problem as well, as I think pointed out by one of the panelists. We access the ability to talk to actors on the ground, including armed actors, the approach geared towards ensuring that you're well perceived and understood by actors on the ground should not be left to the SIMCORT team alone. And that's a big message that we keep on transmitting to partners. We pave the way, we channel information back. Subsequently, nothing should stop you apart from government clearances, which are actually nearly always there, and your internal rules and regulations in terms of you, yourself, UN agency, NGO, other actors, being able to be forward-leaning. That has not been easy. We keep on saying it that once we have gone to newly retaken areas, we move to others, and we expect operational actors to subsequently follow up. But this is definitely something that has developed as a perception that access is dependent fully on the work of a SIMCORT team, and indeed a trend that we need to counter. For the rest, again, just a very brief word on the importance of the humanitarian concept of operations that the authorities developed early on in this crisis. Both the process of developing this concept as well as the existence enables us to engage with the authorities on how the conflict is panning out. The key question as to whether protection of civilians continues to be a central tenet. It's under pressure, we all know that, but the fact that the document was developed and that we have a partnership enables us to work with the government and at the same time also crack sometimes very sensitive nuts in our interaction with the authorities.
Thank you for that additional insight into the Iraq situation in particular. Any other?
I'm Alain Delettre from the Geneva Center for Security Policy. I have the feeling when observing a humanitarian action now that for about 10 years you have also a new problem, the eruption of justice in your action from two sides. On one side you have states with all this blacklisting of the groups with which you have to deal and have negotiations on the ground. In the United States in particular, you can be sued for that as being engaged with terrorist groups. I think it's not the case in Europe yet, but still we have a list of groups which are blacklisted in the European Union. And on the other side, you have the eruption of justice through the families of humanitarian workers who would die on the ground. As many in this city, I started my professional life as an ICRC delegate, and I think when I was there, if something had happened to me, my wife would have not gone to court because there was a kind of understanding that if you do a job like this, you're accepting and your familiars are accepting some risks. And now sometimes I have the feeling also that, leaders of humanitarian organizations are a bit chilly because you have these two risks on two sides, the side of the states and the side of the family, mainly the family of your staff if something happens. Do you see that as a problem? I'm not asking you, Nicolas, because I know ICRC knows how to deal with these things, but I don't know, the Norwegian Refugee Council or others, how do you deal with that?
Take one more here.
I'm Kate Hall from the Steering Committee for Humanitarian Response. Thank you very much for that. I'm going back to my own operational experience, and I'm wondering how much, and also to some of the stuff I saw when I did the OPR, Operation Peer Review in Yemen, I'm wondering how much has to be brought back to some of the basics also around this issue of presence and locations, namely logistics capacity. To be able to operate in secure environments in an independent way, independent from a system. We've talked a lot about system, but I'm not sure that's the right word. You need your own logistics. And there is an issue there of how money flows through the system, what is funded, etc. So that's one question I would ask. The other is you need a very good ability to understand the context, very good analysis and knowledge of the context, both very local but also national, and being able to correlate that. This does not apply to organizations who come in the part of the crisis which is acute, and who by definition are going to need time to understand the context, build the relations, etc. So most likely, as a sort of strategy, going to start with easier to access areas. The question is really for organizations who have been who know the context much better, who have been present for a longer period, what choices are they making and why? So it would be interesting to get your perspective on these different nuances. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Thea Hilhurst. I'm a professor of humanitarian aid and reconstruction at the International Institute of Social Studies. I was just wondering if, going back right to the beginning of the discussion, Julia, you said that coverage is a problem, but also that there is just not enough aid. And how important is that in in what we are discussing? And what I'm thinking about is that I'm here with my research team. We are doing research into situations where disasters and conflict coincide. So if dual disasters, even worse. And one of my colleagues, I was trying to get him to talk, but I'm talking now on his behalf. He just did 4 months of research in South Sudan, where basically there is just so much suffering with so little resources that the question becomes, how do you prioritize anyway? How do you make... So I was just wondering how you see that relationship between coverage and enough, when you said at the beginning there's no... So it's a question to you, you're not part of the panel, but it's still a question to you.
I'll respond anyways. Yeah. But not before taking the comment here from the gentleman.
Abraham from Intersource. I've not been to Iraq. I do not know who are the people who work there, and I don't know the intensity of the extent to which our humanitarian colleagues work out there. We talked about black holes, and I think this is clearly understandable. We've had black holes in almost many of the deeply intensive conflict situations over the last 30 years that I have also experienced. My question is more like, is there a particular area where we are collectively concerned. And if I take the situation of sexual and gender-based violence as an example, you have it today in all of the 4 major conflict areas where there's also famine developing. You have it also in Iraq. How do we do this? Is there a way in which this is collectively discussed and collectively handled? Because we know that on the one hand we'd like to deliver, and we know that this is also an area of concern to the donors, but are we able to really address sexual and gender-based violence in Iraq? We've not been very much been able to address this in many other parts of the world. The topic comes and it goes, it comes and it goes. I just wanted to know whether there's any way in which this could be collectively handled. Thank you.
I'll be egotistical and start with a question that was directed to me. Not enough aid. Of course, we never have enough money to meet all the gaps. I think the important point is that according to the humanitarian principles, you then ought to prioritize the most severe need. Yet when we did this big data crunch about the 4 countries where we have the greatest insecurity, what came out very clearly is that insecurity determines where then the activities happen, not the level of need. And therefore you have a mismatch. You deviate from the humanitarian principle that tells you, in theory, how you should prioritize. And gets you to really have a gap, particularly where there is insecurity. So a much bigger gap than elsewhere. But I think otherwise it also leads into a very big philosophical discussion that links to something Hervé said, are we willing to pay the extra cost? If there has been this big debate in the United Nations as well about unit costing, can we introduce a comparable measure about what it costs to deliver something? And of course it costs more to deliver this in a highly insecure context than in another one. And what is the principle then that we use? Are we, it gets very philosophical. Is this a utilitarian approach where we say, okay, let's serve the most? Or do we have a rights-based one that says, no, we have to take this cost into account? Jamie, you had a question addressed to you, which was about the eruption of justice from the 2 fronts and how to deal with that.
I think there's 2 things going at play there, for sure, right? I don't think there's anything new. I think agencies have always struggled with how do you secure staff to an extent that you know as well that there's a potential of risk for staff. That I highly doubt that in any conflict zone throughout the history of the international humanitarian response or individual agency response, or even before us, missionaries ever took that for granted. I think there's always been a give and take within organizations and within staff to understand what that means. Now, whether or not we're becoming more prone to lawsuits, that's a different question, and I won't comment on that side of it. NRC has also gone through a certain history of that, most recently with the Dadaab case, in which we had a question over kidnappings. But the reality on justice is really, it comes back down to, of course we take risks. We know what we have to do to take risks. How do we balance that is through negotiating with our own staff and with our own selves. What willingness are we willing to, or what is the willingness that we're going to put forward? The question of, do we go into a Boko Haram area? Do we go in farther into West Mosul? What is the give and take that we as a country team are willing to take? Very rarely do those discussions reach regional offices or even head offices. They should be taken at the field because that's where the knowledge is. And it's not ever taken alone. It's taken in negotiation with, in our case, our donors that are funding those programs, our peers on the ground. Ivo's mentioned some of those. So whether or not it's a question of justice or impartiality when it comes to making those judgments, I think it's really about logic. We have to also be clear on what that means. Ultimately, we have to be able to say we've entered into this, as Nicola has mentioned, we've come into this job for a reason. We understand that there are certain risks that we are are able to take and that we're willing to take. And then the ultimate goal, of course, is to help people survive, to build back better and to build better lives, or to find an opportunity that they're able to explore for peace and their own future. So I don't know if I would argue that it's a justice question. I think there's more logic and more rationality involved in that, as opposed to looking at purely along lines of justice.
Then we had the question from Kate about the basics. Can I give that to you, Raquel, to ask? It was about, do we need to go back to basics in terms of logistics and context understanding?
We need to invest in logistics. I mean, it's true that we highlighted that as a precondition. You need to build your capacity to scale up operations or to enter in a new operation, or to scale up when you are in a certain context. We have talked about black holes, but indeed, so one of the main problems is that in some settings that are relatively stable, protracted conflicts, you see that still, even though there is a large deployment of actors, you don't find such capacity. You don't find the capacity with most of those organizations just to scale up and respond to larger crises. I think that donors need to fund that. Need to fund the organizations to build their capacities, to own their own logistics, to own their own negotiation capacity, to own their own. This requires a lot of investment. It's time, it's expertise, and it's a lot of money. It's a money that you need to invest in your own organization. So what the system funds basically projects. And with the remainings of these projects, you fund your in-house capacities, and this is a wrong way to build such capacity. I would like to react briefly to Iraq, Ocha. I think that Iraq, Mosul, has been like the opposite of the emergency gap. What we have seen from the very beginning is a very strong push particularly for taking care of war wounded that have a high value in such a context of a military campaign. MSF has been under the pressure, and I consider myself that MSF has been extremely slow in this crisis. I'm not satisfied with what MSF has done there, but I would put the case of Iraq in a different box. There was a strong interest by everybody to deliver assistance as soon as the military were regaining territory from IS, and I think that there was a strong push on organizations to get there. And we have seen a lot of new actors. Some of them might be our partners in the future. Some of them might be more interesting for you than the old ones around this table. But we have also seen private companies delivering humanitarian assistance within a frame of lack of humanitarian principles, and that we have seen. We have seen for-profit organizations delivering medical assistance in Iraq. This will come at a cost of access, perception, whatever, we don't know. I mean, this is very difficult to measure. And for certain, they have saved lives, and we can say very little about that. They had value because they were saving lives, but it's an interesting case study for all of us. And then going back to the basics, for me, yes, it's about what we were and elaborating on the coverage versus what. It's about criticality. It's about the criticality of the services. What we see is that there is coverage in many of those crises. I mean, if you go at the beginning of a crisis of refugees in DIFA camps in Niger, plenty of organizations stating, first of all, many of them withdrawing for 3 months, and then going back and stating that they were covering needs, but they were not covering critical needs. They were covering basically, I mean, you talk about WASH. WASH is about delivering a certain amount of drinkable water in a hard situation. It's about advising people to wash hands. So this needs to be stated clearly. I mean, the quality of the assistance that we provide in many of the crises is clearly overstated.
And there was one comment or question about SGBV, sexual and gender-based violence. Who wants to take that? Yeah, Nicola?
Yeah, I can take that. No, thank you for mentioning it, because it really is an issue. It really is an issue. It's not just an issue in Iraq, or, I don't know, you mentioned 4 contexts. For us, it has become an issue in every single context where we work in. Before, it was a bit like, or generally our approach is, okay, our teams, they make an assessment, they say, okay, we have detected this and this need, so we're going to address it. With sexual and gender-based violence, it's different. If they don't want to do it, they have to say why. If they don't find it, They have to say why and what they're doing to find it, because that's a bit of the problem. That's why we're not where we want to be. It's difficult to really be able to seize the problematic, the issues, and then to actually provide a meaningful answer. But it's definitely a concern, and here I think there's a very important role from the donors. Donors push this one very much, because and I repeat myself, it's a difficult issue for a delegation to deal with this. There are cultural issues, there are maybe religious issues, there are probably also an issue about skills, how to address the phenomenon and so on. So there was a strong push from donors, and I think that's very valuable in this sense. Because well, another point to take into consideration is do no harm. You have to be very careful in how you go about, because you risk stigmatizing the victims. And if you do, for example, I don't know, a health clinic just for victims of sexual violence, and this can be men, boys, and women and girls, you will not get many people, because you really stigmatize all the patients that go to that place. So you really have to be careful about how you go about it, and not actually make it worse for the victims of these acts. For us, what is important, and we've had, I think, a very interesting discussion with MSF, is about peer learning. MSF has made experiences which can be very beneficial for us, and I guess vice versa. I think it's very important that we as humanitarian actors on these issues, which are delicate, sensitive, culturally difficult to seize and to get to the bottom to, in order to provide an adequate response, there we have to exchange, we have to learn from each other. And I think that was a very important first step that we did a few weeks ago, and I think this will have to continue probably also with other actors in order to really come up with something that is much more coherent and holistic than what is being offered at the moment.
Any immediate reactions? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, maybe on the gender-based violence, and also taking advantage that Geneva Call is present and disclosing part of our discussions we had last week. There's been this campaign on fighters, not killers. And we were discussing last week with the president of Geneva Call about this issue of gender-based violence, and that too often the emphasis has been put on treating the consequences of it rather than preventing action. And so we were sort of in a brainstorming mode, is can we use the fighters, not killers, to make it fighters, not rapers? Because the issue is indeed very culturally sensitive, but when you put it, you can engage. There have been cases of armed groups bringing, someone said, yeah, this guy actually, he raped someone. What do we do with it? So they wanted to take justice, but it's too late. It's somehow, yes, justice should be made, but how can we anticipate? And I think there are different ways, which is also how you raise awareness. And I don't know if Mehmet would like to comment on the work that is done with armed groups, because they are not signatories to any international conventions, but at the same time, you refer to the proliferation of terrorist groups and armed groups. This is a reality that we face, and how some of them are in search for legitimacy, for credibility. So we have to take them on these sort of issues and bring it to very concrete issues like the gender-based violence, because this is the way of trying to bring this to a culture, and to a culture whereby they realize that this is not part of the normal way of waging war. And I'd just like also to make another comment on the issue of prioritization and coverage. This issue will always be with us, since we don't, that was one of the main elements we've all seen in the past years. Thankfully, the worldwide funding has increased. Now it's the biggest ever. We are over close to, I think, 20 billion or even more, I don't know. But you look at the appeals, whether ICRC, year after year, now it's always your biggest appeal. The UN is the same. So the gap is just increasing. So when the study puts the question of, how we're compromising with the principles, because sometimes we have to make choices. Each actor has to make choices. Where do I go? Which area? Which sector? So I think here it's an issue which is at the level of each and every actor of the humanitarian system. But more importantly, and this is we didn't really discuss this point of the coordination, how we bring together so that we have a more intelligent reflection on how we fill the gaps. And the same way, like in Mosul, you have actors that can be on the front line, others who are not. I think the issue here is about complementarity. Complementarity, but also knowing in which conditions you work. And I think this is where the notion maybe that should be further explored among the humanitarian community is what do we consider as acceptable and not acceptable? Where are the code of conducts? You said some old organizations. I think old is beautiful, so it's good to have old organizations. And for the youth, the young organizations or the new organizations, they have to be educated. They have to be molded into this principal approach, and we need to create the platform for that. Worse would be to have maverick organizations go on the front line, save lives, humanitarian imperative, and believe that they are the righteous ones, as opposed to the risk-averse old organization. I think that would be pitching it in a wrong way. So I think building these platforms of discussions, of coordination, is absolutely key. And the studies that have been made, released lately, or to be done in the few days, should help to bring these platforms. And at least I can mention that for ECHO, there is an interest, a keen interest of offering this platform of discussions with this larger cross-section of actors, humanitarian actors, whether old or new.
Here, this lady, and then the gentleman.
Hi, my name is Avril, and I work with MSF. And I came back from Mosul a couple of months ago. One of the big questions that is preoccupying the humanitarians there are organizations like Free Burma Rangers, armed Christian so-called humanitarians with their young children living on the roof of the hospital where they're working, receiving fawning coverage month after month about the rescue work and the brave work that they're doing. So it's very difficult for us also to work alongside organizations that have been subcontracted by the WHO with funding from ECHO, where security forces are coming into the hospitals, into these medical facilities, and doing checks to cross-check the names of patients against those who are perceived to be or accused of being ISIS sympathizers. Very much against medical ethics, inappropriate, I think, by any standard of humanitarian principles that many of you have talked about as being all the more needed in a context like that. So my question is for our ECHO representative, why are you funding some activities like this where through the WHO and some of these organizations, the motivation, and I would acknowledge that they're doing some medical work, but the motivation is mercenary. It's to make $6,000 a week as a doctor.
My name is Rod Mina. I'm the one working with Thea in the research project in ISS. And it's more a following up question. It's about these places that are difficult to reach. They are dangerous, they are risky. They're not only difficult to reach, to act on them, also to get information from them, to know what is happening on the ground. So at the end, when you need to prioritize and to decide, I'm going to respond in this area, not this area, or to whom to aid, and also how to aid them, how do you, it's not only about how do you make or you take those decisions, it's also about how do you inform those decisions. So which are the tools, or how you gather information, or if you don't really are able to have enough information to have informed decisions, how is this process of decision, and how do you decide at the end what to do on the ground? It's more about that.
Yeah, I'm Mehmet from Geneva Call. I'm leading the Middle East programs at Geneva Call. Hervé just mentioned our work related to the, let's say, mostly fighter not killer campaign.
Hear you anymore.
The sexual violence is very, as you know better than me, is very delicate issue, especially with armed groups. But anyhow, we have included in our work the sexual violence aspects in all our activities already existing. We have always addressed this issue in the trainings, in the bilateral meetings with the armed groups. And indeed, we also realize that we need to do more about this issue and to be more creative, and also to bring on board more armed groups to prevent the sexual violence. At the beginning in Syria, for example, in 2012, we were thinking that this issue will be less priority because of cultural sensitivity, or in the Middle East, that especially in Syria, people are educated, it will be rejected, the fighters will not dare, say, to be involved in this kind of violations. We were wrong. Indeed, 2-3 years later, when we saw the state failed, there is no more control, there are many groups, warlords, there is no more control in the ground, and this issue became really a headache. And so the consequences are very grave, and we will still face in the future the consequences of these violations. Therefore, I agree that there is a need to enhance the campaign to prevent the sexual violence among the armed groups. And we are thinking how to extend with a new format, with the new languages, with different cultural aspects, this campaign in order to address the issue. We use a lot of social media in Middle East, where it is working, but not everywhere. These means are very efficient, but like in Syria or in Iraq, in Yemen, in these countries, we can use new technologies to address as well. And also, it's not enough, of course, but we have to be very, very sensitive and creative to address this issue. What I'm trying to say is possible. If there are means and support, we can do more, certainly, and in coordination with our organization, of course, not just Geneva Call, but there is a room to improve the situation. Thank you.
My name is Wahid, master student at HERE, Center for Education and Research in Humanitarian Action. And where it matters, it's of course in the field, but it's also in nowadays everywhere. And I'm interested to know about the role of diaspora organization, especially in Syria and Iraq. They are very engaged. And how, let's call them traditional humanitarian actors, could engage them, and what could be the potential risks?
Thank you. We have time for just a quick round of responses. There was one which was specifically directed to you, Hervé, if you want to take that one, and then each can pick one.
We're aware of the concerns raised by MSF, and even actually publicly in a blog or in an opinion op-ed. To our knowledge, most of the humanitarian partners involved in the trauma care response are not embedded with the Iraqi forces as indicated. That all hospitals, maybe with the exception of Samaritan Purse, are gun-free. It's true that some hospitals do have armed protection outside, like the Nineveh General Hospital, where ICRC is also active. It does not mean we should be careful not depicting this as a mixing and a blurring of action or presence, heavy military presence in medical areas. We know that there have been also, it's been referred by MSF that some personnel would wearing badges or sort of pro-defeat of ISIL. To our knowledge, and maybe it comes from the Burmese Rangers Hospital, but these are not actors that are part of the trauma working group and the trauma response. So I'm not saying that everybody is policed and well behaved. They may always, I mean, I remember always the case of the response in Haiti. So it was not a conflict, but you had like, I don't know how many organizations, I mean, you cannot control. I can say that WHO is really being careful with the kind of activities, and I cannot speak for them, but they are careful with the kind of actors they are working with. True, I mean, I was myself 2 weeks ago at a trauma and stabilization point. We were really on the front line, where and you have people that are wounded, that are extracted from the battlefield. And so what happens, that out of 10, 8 come in Humvees. 1 come by their own means, and some come with an ambulance, but very limited. That's the reality of the conflict zone today. And when they arrive at the trauma stabilization point, what happens? You've got medical personnel. They take the child. I mean, I saw it was that a child just arrived when we were there, heavily wounded. He was stabilized in 10 minutes, and then there was an ambulance just taking the child when he was stabilized up to the hospital where ICRC is operating. So that was an operation. The fact that there were military presence around does not disqualify the action that has been taken, and we recognize that in such a complex environment, there are complementarities between organizations, and the same way we never pushed anyone to be on the front line. What is important is those who are in the front line do not trespass basic rules when it comes to engaging or working with military. And I think this is what is important. Because if some humanitarian organizations were to do things in this trauma stabilization point of discarding some patients for allegedly they are pro-ISIL, then that would be a real problem. So in that way, from what I witness, or from what I know, there possibly be a few organizations, but a tiny minority that are there. Maybe they are proselyte, maybe they have a different agenda. We've seen this in other crises, but I would not like these extreme cases to tarnish the whole humanitarian response in Iraq. I think it would be to pick up a wrong fight, so to say, in this situation where we have so much difficulty collectively to press the message towards all partners about humanitarian principles. And it's true, maybe we should have the courage, we humanitarian organizations, OCHA, and donors, to go then to see these organizations which are a bit free-willing and say, guys, you know that you are putting at risk the whole humanitarian community by your actions. Maybe we should do that, and maybe we don't do that enough.
Okay, any quick comment to finish?
No, as a reaction, no, to the issue of Iraq, not really. And then responding to a question on how do we make our choices, and how do we assess places and the needs in places that are difficult to access. First of all, there is experience. I mean, for instance, who couldn't see Nigeria coming? I mean, we have seen that in Angola in 2002. Same kind of, same profile of crisis, same profile of military campaign. We could expect the consequences. We should have anticipated that. So this is, I mean, we should be taking advantage of our long experience to really make bets on where are the major needs. Second, the risk taking is also about that. It's about betting where are the crises, just by understanding the dynamic of a conflict, and by experience just betting, well, this is the place where I should go, so I will go. Then there is nothing, Malaysia. Conducting exploratory missions, which is a basic tool for humanitarians. I mean, just having the willingness to go there, assess, measure the needs, fast, and quick, without expecting that the humanitarians are going to be able to collect a lot of data before jumping into a crisis, because this is not the way around. I mean, and then using technology. I mean, this is something that we are using in some settings. We are just using phones, mobile phones, satellites, and other ways of engaging with populations that are difficult to access to make our choices. But there is a lot of betting, and there is a lot of risk.
That's a difficult one. Actually, so I'm just gathering bits and pieces, and so I think I'm going to take to our ECOSOC House panel. I'm going to take two things. Maybe the humanitarian principles and international humanitarian law isn't yet being talked about enough, contrary to things like the Nexus, for example, which is being talked to death. So maybe that should be, we should have more of a focus on that in our discussions, in our panel discussions, and how we do things. And the other one is that I want to pick up again this idea of the whole of government approach when we're dealing with situations that have a difficulty of access, and maybe have a more a dialogue just with basically all the actors, but region specific. Because what we do now is we have governmental formats, we have NGO formats, we have the UN formats. Maybe we should rather pick a specific problem and get everybody around the desk and look at it in terms of access. So that's my two takeaways from this evening.
Example that you've brought up from the floor from MSF is one that's interesting. There we can say very clearly, this is what I'm trying to get across in many ways, not just here, but also in ECOWAS for the rest of the week. When we're talking about humanitarian action, we don't have to be talking about principled humanitarian actors. We're talking about agencies or contractors or right-wing religious groups of whatever denomination out there responding because either they think it's what they ought to do, or it's because they want to earn money to do it, or they want to be principled humanitarian actors. I don't think we need to get everyone around the table. I think we can be selective when we're talking about principled humanitarian action. I think we should lead by example, for sure. But at the moment when we try to get everyone around the table, we have the World Humanitarian Summit. And that's my biggest dilemma. When we walked away from the World Humanitarian Summit, protection was missing. IHL was missing. Protection of civilians were missing. The role of accountability of affected populations was touched upon, but it wasn't one of the key things. The development nexus, yes. I actually think that's important, because I think it can divide the way in which we see principled humanitarian action, people who work inside of a humanitarian response, maybe not principled or what we might perceive as principled, and then development actors and development funders. And all of those have a role to play. We may not always like the role, but they could actually highlight, your example could actually highlight why we want more principled humanitarian actors. And then we have to be brave enough to stand up and say, excuse me, either you're here for the right reasons or you're not. And if you're not, let's go back to your funders and talk about why they're here in the first place. So I think there is a role to play, but I'm not so sure if everybody should be around the table at all at the same time. So that's my key takeaway. And I think going into ECOSOC, it's a good blend of humanitarian development nexus. The grand bargain is important. NRC is a firm believer of the grand bargain. We want to be, as is Germany, one of our biggest partners on this, we do want to see a change in the efficiency. But it doesn't change the system. It just makes us more efficient at what we're doing. So it's important to have those discussions and dialogues. It's different than the World Humanitarian Summit. As someone who worked for 3 years organizing that, I can say that I'm not exactly happy with the outcomes, but the dialogues are there. So I think all of these different dichotomies of the system are what's important, because that's what makes us a system. Not an ecosystem, not a diversity. It's actually, we're working under the same goals in some way.
Great. Last word to you, as befits the host as well, to this wonderful evening.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, okay, there's a lot to say. Maybe just, let me jump on what you just said, what was missing, because I think it's still missing. Nobody talks about the IDPs. Nobody talks about the detainees. And we talk a little bit about protection of civilians. And I think that really is big chunks that are missing and that have been pushed a little bit under the table under the guise of, okay, there is, you know, we have to end all needs, so who cares about those? So, and I think that's a bit dangerous. Maybe just on the nexus also, because that's the one that is, it's a bit the elephant in the room. In the end, I wonder if the whole debate there is not a bit artificial. In the end, it's about people. It's about serving the needs of the people. And when you look at, for example, Yemen today, you look at Yemen, you have a conflict in Yemen that has disastrous consequences, humanitarian consequences. At the same time, and because of this conflict, municipal workers are not paid anymore because the state is pretty much breaking down. So that means nobody picks up the garbage. When nobody picks up the garbage, you get disease. When you get disease, you get cholera, and when you add cholera to the conflict, then you have a problem. And this problem is called Yemen. Now, the thing is, we are out there and we're covering, I don't know, maybe 20% of the needs of all the cholera patients. We try to work on the conflict and so on. But somebody has to pay those salaries. Because otherwise, that garbage is not going to go away. It's going to pile up ever more. Now, maybe we have to do it. I don't know. Maybe we have to do development work and pay salaries of municipal workers until the state can do it again. Maybe somebody can come in. World Bank wants to work more in fragile contexts and so on. If they can come in, fine. The issue is that it's about people. It's about serving their needs. And maybe just to round it up with the principles, if somebody else wants to come in and pay those salaries, they probably have to abide by the principles. Otherwise, they won't have access.
Can we just look at Ed, whether he wants to say anything before we... he does.
2 or 3 points as takeaways. 1, be open and honest on the compromises that you have to deal with or that you have to strike. In the report, I think we make the point, the report on Iraq, don't be embarrassed about those compromises. Actually, I think it's much more embarrassing to actually say, no, we're fine on the principles, but in reality, actually, it turns out there are all sorts of issues. And in that sense, actually, we just used the 4 principles as the analytical framework for the Iraq report, and it delivered a ton of information. And I think that is really also the point that was made by a number of you. Principles are not something abstract, but they need to be put in practice. And I'm very glad that, in fact, you shared your practice and your experience in that sense. I was thinking, Irene, that you made a point in terms of you having to sit in Berlin, having to think. I mean, I was sort of thinking about this in the sense of, thinking about all those requests that you have to answer and the decisions, the funding allocations that you have to make, particularly for situations which were called black holes. I mean, the gap areas, the areas which other people called hard to reach and so on, which we think is a very useless term. How do you actually make that decision? Because precisely for those areas, information will be very fragmented. And so because the information you find in the appeals and so on, obviously is for the areas where lots of agencies are concentrated. So the question there particularly being, or the point actually being, let's make sure that actually we have that discussion and a dialogue, particularly as Hervé pointed out, in the sense of actually, so we are open on the obstacles, the dilemmas that we face, the issues that we have to deal with in terms of principles, and let's have that discussion. I mean, obviously there's an inherent contradiction because agencies often want to look better in the eyes of donors in order to secure their future funding. And I think we precisely need to be more honest and open on the dilemmas in that sense that we face. With that, there was a lot more said, I know, in the debate, particularly also the interesting point Ivo made on the new, so-called new actors and so on. Do we involve them around the table or not? I think actually it would be interesting to have that debate. Here, it seems to some degree we're sort of having a discussion relatively among the like-minded. Who are those others? It keeps on being a challenge, I suppose, for all of us. And maybe that's a topic for a next debate. If we could get some of those to Geneva, it would be interesting. With that, I'm going to thank you, all of you, Nicola, Jamie, Julia, you as moderator, Irene, Raquel, and Hervé. Thank you very much. I think you actually deserve an applause.